Let's start tonight in what will ultimately be a new series, although I want to just say I'm not approaching this the way we approached the Gospel of John. I'm not approaching this the way we approached 1 John. For the past 3.5 years, we have worked through 2 books of the Bible, John, 1 John, back to back. And each week, we just went to the next verse. Some weeks, we went to the next sentence within the same verse. We didn't have any pacing, no speed. Sometimes we did 4 lessons in one chapter. Sometimes we did 7 or 8 lessons in one chapter. None of us have seemed to care. We keep coming back. I think we've actually gotten closer, stronger, enjoying ourselves more as a community. So I see no reason to swap it all up. I am in a theme, but we aren't doing the left to right, word to word, verse to verse, as much as we are going to try to tackle the body of a sermon, the longest public sermon Jesus ever preached. It's most famously called the Sermon on the Mount. It encompasses the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of Matthew. We will work those chapters. I may not always work in sequence. I may not always go in chronological order. We might jump around a little bit, and the reason for that is because the sermon seems to be piecemealed together in some respects from some things Jesus says in other Gospels. For instance, the Lord's Prayer is in the Sermon on the Mount, but it also exists in another form in another Gospel in which the disciples say, teach us to pray, and as if it's happening at its own moment, which kind of tells us that some of these things in the Sermon on the Mount might have been collections of things that Jesus says. It might be delivered all at one big long moment. It doesn't really matter. Point is, if I feel compelled to jump, we'll jump, but we'll try to cover all the bases in the Sermon on the Mount. The longest public discourse in Jesus' ministry. It contains the most famous statements of Jesus in regards to his principles of theology. The Sermon on the Mount gives us the Beatitudes. The Sermon on the Mount, as we said, gives us the Lord's Prayer. It gives us the Golden Rule. And it gives us a whole bunch of stuff in between. It's probably the most controversial sermon ever preached, simply because 2,000 years after its inception, we're still arguing over what it means. How much of it applies to us? What do we actually do with it? Do we take it literally word for word? Is some of it allegorical and some of it literal? Is it confined within the context of a first century audience? Does it actually work in the 21st century? Will it work in the 30th century? Is it timeless? Is this the kind of message that exists inside of a Roman Empire with a Caesar and, say, an iron fist? Is it the kind of sermon that works, that isn't even necessary in a democracy or in capitalism or across the pond? What do we do with these statements of Jesus? Because some of them are difficult to wrestle with. Some of them are the kinds of things that we like to quote, read, but kind of ignore when it comes to the scriptures we quote. Because some of the things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount lay out an ethic, and I'll say this up front, I'll probably say it 100 times in this series. Jesus lays out an ethic in the Sermon on the Mount that in many ways doesn't even resemble the Christianity a lot of us signed up for. We're going to come across some moments in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 where we'll swallow really hard when we read it. And we'll have to look at the text again and go, what do you think? And look at it again and go, am I living that? And I think that's its greatest contribution to Christianity, is the fact that it lays out there in front of us something we have to wrestle with. We have to contend with. It's not only the longest discourse, but it also puts to silence the criticism that Jesus is out here living his theology, but he never really teaches his theology. You'll hear some people say, if you really want theology, and I've even said something along these lines before, if you really want the depth of theology, go to Paul, the Apostle Paul. He writes 2/3 of the New Testament. He'll give you your New Covenant theology. If you want to see a world in a crossover between an Old Covenant and New, we say go to Jesus. And almost by default, when you say things like that, you're saying, if you really want to know what it means to be in the New Covenant, go talk to Paul. If you want to know what it meant to live in Jesus' day, go talk to Jesus. And I don't want to relegate Jesus to 2,000 years old. He who was the same yesterday, today, and forever has something to say to us based on what he said yesterday. So I would say that not only is the statement wrong when we go, Jesus didn't teach theology, Paul did. No, Jesus' theology is the Sermon on the Mount, and it's the theology of God's love. It's the theology of what God acts like.